Terrific. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully there'll be plenty of time at the end for some questions or for some discussion. But I've called this talk Space, Stress and Surveillance. And I think that's kind of the big themes I'm going to draw upon within this piece of work, within this presentation this afternoon. So just a quick introduction to me for those that might not know me already. My name is Adam. I was a secondary school teacher and leader for 15 years, and I'm now a lecturer and researcher at the University of Derby. And a couple of years ago, I finished my doctorate, which I guess broadly looked at LGBT plus education, but it specifically looked at the experiences of teachers. And I thought it would just be good to contextualize my kind of passion or interest in the subject to begin with. So I started secondary school in 1995. Wait for it, there's a great photo here. There it is, mum dug that one out for me. The reason I shared that photo and the significance of starting in 1995 is actually that was quite a difficult time to go to school and I'd work out your identity because it was under the shadow of Section 28. So there's I was about to say famous quote, but perhaps infamous is a better description. A quote here from Margaret Thatcher in 1987, who said this: "Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated." Kind of makes my blood run cold reading that quote, especially as it's such kind of recent history. But I share it because I want to just give a flavour of kind of like what my own experience was at school, growing up gay in the 90s with no kind of sense of inclusion or support or visibility within the curriculum. And also my motivation for doing this work now. Obviously, schools are making improvements with LGBT plus inclusion, but there's still a long way to go. So I kind of just wanted to contextualize that so you understand my motivation for this work, but also then thinking about what the experiences are, people that went to school then who are now teachers, which I was while doing this piece of research. So it might be helpful to spend a moment talking about some of the key terms I'll use in this presentation. I use the initialism LGBT+. I of course recognize there's longer versions and different iterations of this. I tend to use LGBT+ just because it's easy to say when you say a lot, like I'm going to be doing in this presentation. But I use it very much as that umbrella term for people who perhaps don't identify as heterosexual or cisgender, which is the next definition for the key terms. So cisgender or cis, as I'll probably be saying during the presentation, would describe somebody whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned at birth. So for example, I would identify as a cisgender male. I was assigned male at birth, and that is my gender identity as well. And then we've got these couple of big words here, heteronormativity, which I'm going to come back to because it's very much the theme of this talk. And then the second one, or the fourth one, I suppose, is cisnormativity. And that's referring to kind of the default assumption that people are cisgender or cis, but also the kind of privileging of people that are cisgender. And we're going to explore those ideas through the talk. So just a little bit about the research I did for the study that's going to underpin what I talk about. For my doctoral research, I did a photo elicitation study. And what that means is I had a range of LGBT teachers, participants, and they were asked to take photos of spaces in their school where they felt the most and least safe or comfortable. Now, photo elicitation is a really incredible method, and I felt lucky to be able to use it. And it's one I kind of really endorse people that are thinking about doing this type of research, because it allows you to see through the eyes of people. And I think when we're thinking about marginalized groups like LGBT and schools, which are often very hard to access, they can reveal incredibly rich data and capture in the moment feelings that can very quickly dissipate. And then when they look at those photos later on, those feelings are captured again, and it creates this very sort of rich layered data, which reveals really sort of fascinating insights, as I'll demonstrate soon. So there's a real broad range of participants within my study, as you can kind of see there, but also from a range of schools and contexts, so private schools, public schools, religious schools, single-sex schools, a real kind of a richness to the data, not only in terms of the participants, but also the kind of contexts in which they were working. So participants took these photos and they sent them to me, and I printed them, which is always good fun, trying to think about potentially what they represent, and often it's not what they do represent. And then we sat down in person for most of them and a few online to discuss the significance of why they'd taken these photos, which produced this really, really rich data. And as you can imagine, it produced hundreds and hundreds of themes and really key and useful and important themes for the work. The two I'm going to mostly focus on this afternoon is this idea of heteronormativity, which I've alluded to, and then the implications for visibility of LGBT plus people in a school. And I'm going to talk under these headings for this presentation. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of chunk it. So I'm going to present first of all the dilemma that comes from this idea of heteronormativity and some of the dilemmas that the teachers faced in their school settings. And then I'm going to use three key pieces of theory to explore those. So the idea of spatial production, panoptic surveillance, and minority stress to explore those ideas. And then I'm going to touch upon the idea of disruption, that if you are LGBT in a space where that's perhaps not expected or assumed, what that then means in terms of the implications for those around us, before coming to a conclusion at the end. So let's start then with this idea of what the dilemma is that kind of underpinned all the work. And it's kind of this really. I use this image to describe or kind of illustrate what I mean by this idea of heteronormativity. And we could describe heteronormativity in a few ways, but essentially it's the perhaps default assumption, the silent assumption that people are heterosexual. And it's also the privileging of heterosexuality. Now that's really presents a unique challenge in a school, because schools are places where sexuality is deemed inappropriate to talk about, yet schools are stubbornly heteronormative. So it's assumed that everybody in those buildings are both cisgender and heteronormative. So if you're not an LGBT person, you're caught in this, or sorry, if you are an LGBT person rather, you're caught in this double bind where it's assumed that you're cisgender and heterosexual, yet it's deemed inappropriate to discuss sexuality. So you're then caught in this dilemma of, do I come out or announce my sexuality, my gender identity, or do I keep it silent and hidden and kind of code switch in those behaviors? So that creates a real dilemma, and it's a dilemma that came through every single conversation within the research. And actually, of course, LGBT teachers aren't prepared for how to deal with this. There's no course on the PGCE about how to deal with this very challenging and difficult dilemma people are presented with. I need to have my cat wants to come in and join us for this presentation, so I'm just going to let him in. So crucially, it's thinking about this idea of what it means to be visible in a school. Because if a school is heteronormative and it's assumed that you are cisgender or heterosexual and you are not, you're put under this idea of a metaphorical spotlight. And it means that you're often very hyper-visible as a consequence of that. So I'm just going to share a little bit of the theory that helped me kind of conceptualize these ideas of visibility. The first one was Patai's notion of surplus visibility. And what Patai is describing here is the way in which people who belong to minority groups are put under this metaphorical spotlight. And their identity is kind of extrapolated from part to whole, where this one aspect of identity is seen as the entirety of their identity, but they're also seen to represent the entirety of a minority group. And obviously the stress and strain that puts on somebody is significant. Another piece of theory which helped me, slightly more nuanced than that, was Pelota's. She had three notions of visibility that people hold in particular spaces. The first one was this notion of passing visibility, the ways in which we might mask or hide our visibility. So, while it's called passing visibility, I would describe that as invisibility. It's concealing and hiding your sexuality or gender identity to pass with the expectations of being cisgender and heterosexual. The slightly more nuanced description, and it was probably the most relevant one to all the participants in my study, was this idea of bordering visibility. And I think if anyone on the call is LGBT, you'll kind of recognize this, that in life there are certain situations where you are more or less comfortable sharing and revealing parts of your LGBT identity. In some places you feel safe to do so, in some not safe at all, and sometimes in a school with things changing so quickly, that can be a constant navigation and thinking about visibility. And it's almost like people have this dimmer switch where they have to turn up or down their gayness or their transness or their queerness in particular spaces in order to feel safe. And that's gotten a real sort of emotional toll to it, because you're constantly kind of horizon scanning and surveying a place, whether it is or not able to be safe in that space. And the final form of visibility Pelota talks about is this idea of polluting visibility, because actually, as I said earlier, if a space is heterosexual, heteronormative, and you're not that thing, actually there might be a little bit of disruption or resistance through your visibility, and that could be a positive thing, which I'm going to explore a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. But crucially to this point is, to be visible is therefore to be seen. So that very much brings us to some of the photos that were in my study. And I'm going to share just 4 photos this afternoon to explore some of the key themes and ideas that came from my study. So these are 4 photos from different participants, which represent spaces in the school where they felt unsafe. And they look like fairly innocuous photos, actually, and that's why we're going to explore them with some theory in a moment. But what these photos have in common are they're often highly visible spaces, But what was really interesting is when I kind of quizzed or asked more about these photos to participants about what had happened in these spaces to make them feel unsafe, most of the time nothing had happened in these spaces. They couldn't point to a particular incident that had made them feel unsafe or they'd been discriminated against. And I had to sit with that for a while in terms of trying to, with an academic head on, trying to get an understanding of the significance of these spaces. And this is the kind of question that was kind of rattling around my head. Why do these LGBT teachers feel unsafe in these spaces when nothing has ever happened to them there? And like I say, I was then trying to find some relevant theory to try and conceptualize the feelings they were experiencing in these places. So that brings us to the first bit of theory I'm going to introduce this afternoon, this idea of space, the ways in which spaces are produced and the way in which space is experienced. And I'm going to use the work of Henri Lefebvre to kind of describe that. So Lefebvre uses the word production to conceptualize the ways in which space is not something abstract or passive, nor the sum of parts contained within it, but something lived and fundamental to human beings' understanding and experience of the world. So space is something that is alive, interactive, is being produced and reproduced in time, and it's not something static. And that's a really interesting way to conceptualize what space is, but also what people are feeling in some of these spaces. So central to Lefebvre's theory of production is this idea of a spatial triad, which I'm going to show you in just a second. And it's designed to conceptualize how the interplay of three inseparable, it's important to think about how they interact at all times. The interplay of three inseparable elements produce our understanding and experience of space. And it looks like this, three overlapping layers of conceived space, perceived space, and lived space. And the overlapping and interaction of these elements produce our experience of social space. So I'll just spend a few moments talking about each of these and what they might look like. So Lefebvre outlines the first one as a conceived space. So this is the physical space as conceived and designed by architects, leaders, persons in positions of power who are designing a building. And the space will include things such as the bricks and mortar of the building, the facilities, the resources, all the sort of physical elements within it. And imprinted upon that is an idea of intellect. Buildings are designed with particular people and particular purposes in mind. That's really important to think about, particularly when we think about when schools are built and perhaps why they're not fit for purpose now, particularly through the lens of LGBT plus inclusion. So the conceived space, the kind of physical space with a level of intellect imprinted upon that. The next overlapping layer is the idea of a perceived space. So we could describe it as this: the organization of space, including routines, activities, beliefs, the culture, and how a space is discussed and represented. And the perceived discourse or discussion or thinking around a space can exist independently of the physical space. For example, I'm going to Canada next year. I've never been to Canada before, but I already have a set of beliefs, a set of ideas about what it's going to be like, what I think their culture is like. And that may or may not be right, but I have a kind of an instinct, a natural reaction when I think about that place or any of the other places. And that feeling can exist independently of a space. So I think that's really helpful for us to conceptualize the idea of a physical space and perhaps how people feel about that said space, whether they're there or not. And then the third overlapping layer is this idea of our lived space. And this is the individual, and that's a really key aspect of this, the individual subjective human experience which overlaps and tries to make sense of the conceived and perceived space and their interactions, tries to make sense of them. And I like this word at the bottom here of intuition. It's when an individual sees something beyond what is presented. And that was really helpful for me to think about these photos, because again, they look fairly innocuous at first glance, but actually, when we add the rich narratives to those, we are revealing something beyond what is represented within those space, a real deep understanding of people's feelings when they are within these spaces. So this is the triad, the overlap, the interaction of these three elements. Now, the thing I found really helpful to think about in terms of this triad is how actually, we talked about how the lived space tries to make sense of the conceived space and perceived space. And for most people, it does make sense of it. There's a sense of congruency, a bit of joined up there. But for some people, there's often this feeling of incongruency. And this is how I found the theory helpful to conceptualize the feelings in some of these spaces. So Watkins argues that a Lefebvrean analysis can be used as an analytical tool to identify problematic issues within a social event. And as such, provides the opportunity to address those issues and think about what may be missing, which is the really interesting bit, I think. So, for example, cisgender and heterosexual people often experience kind of congruency within their space and surroundings in a school. And as such, their identity is both intelligible, it's privileged, they experience kind of a sense of harmony and coherence in that space. And again, go back to the water example earlier, they don't really realize it because as their identity is kind of centered and elevated, it's kind of what they've always known and what they expect. Whereas again, if you're not cisgender or heterosexual, you might experience this disconnect in that space, where a space for most people that feels safe doesn't feel that way for you. And this is perhaps a slightly humorous example way of kind of illustrating this point, but you may or may not have heard of Paris syndrome before. I'm going to put this headline on the screen. Just give you a moment to read it. So apparently Japanese tourists, common in Japanese tourists, apparently, when they go to Paris, they often have these psychiatric breakdowns, these very visceral feelings and effects because Paris wasn't what they expected. Because they expected all of these things. They expected the perceived and the conceived elements on the screen here. What Paris looks like, the kind of romance, the artistry, the kind of all the things that we associate with Paris. But when they got there, often they realized that, a coffee costs €7 and parts of Paris can be quite smelly and they might be met by rude members of staff or things like that. And their experience was so disconnected from the perceived and the conceived spaces. They had these very visceral kind of responses to it. And while that feels a slightly light-hearted example, I think it helps illustrate the way that often LGBT people feel in the spaces of schools. For most people, they experience the congruency. Like Parisians obviously expected these things and it's nothing unusual to them. And I think that's a good way of thinking about how cis-het people in school often feel. But for the LGBT people, they often have these kind of quite visceral responses because their experience of the perceived and the conceived space are quite different. So we're going to start exploring these photos a little bit with that first bit of theory in mind. And I'm going to start with this photo here. This is my participant. She took a photo in the women's toilets at the school. She described herself as not entirely cisgendered. She described herself as she said didn't embody traditional femininity was how she described it. And when speaking about the significance of this space, she said this. She said, "I absolutely hate it. I absolutely hate it. I just don't feel like I have any privacy there. And it's somewhere I feel I need privacy. I feel very vulnerable there and I avoid it at all costs." So this space, if we think about it in terms of that triad, a toilet is a very gendered space, both in the way it's conceived and perceived. And for most people, if you are cisgender, it's perhaps not a place you'd give an enormous amount of thought because your gender is made intelligible there. But if you're not cisgender, or perhaps even if you're not entirely cisgendered, as this participant described, your lived experience of this space is quite different. You're being reminded by a physical space in a school that you don't belong and your identity is not kind of centered there. And she described avoiding this toilet at all costs and sometimes not going to the toilet because her lived experience of it was one of distress, but also one of surveillance where she felt like she was being observed by others. Whether that was true or not, it's irrelevant. That was her experience of it, sort of feeling like she was under the gaze of others, which leads us to the second bit of theory I'd like to spend a bit of time thinking about, which is this idea of surveillance. And again, the photos very much have this idea and this theme of surveillance in common. So it wouldn't be an LGBT kind of academic presentation without some Foucault. So here it is. But the idea, Foucault's work on the panopticon and kind of panoptic gaze and panoptic surveillance is really helpful here to conceptualize what people are often feeling in these spaces. So for those that don't know, panopticon is kind of a disciplinary concept brought to life in the form of a central observation tower placed in a circle of prison cells. And this is designed so from the tower, a guard can see every cell and inmates, but the inmates can't see into the tower. And therefore, crucially, the design of this is that prisoners will never know whether or not they're being watched. And they begin to internalize surveillance and therefore modify and change their behavior, assuming they might be being observed at any time. And this is exactly what is happening in many of these photos and for many of the participants. They feel like, while it's not a literal panopticon of the design here, they're experiencing these spaces as places of observation, of surveillance, and not knowing whether they're being seen or not, and consequently kind of modifying, changing their behaviors, internalizing that sense of surveillance. And some participants described internalizing surveillance so much that even when they weren't at school, when they were out and about in the shops or in the pub with their friends or something, constantly being aware and conscious of being seen by others and read as LGBT. So again, let's look at another photo to think about this idea of surveillance, but also this idea of space. So this was from another participant. Her wife worked at the school, and that's relevant to the description of this account here. She said this. I've never experienced any problems in this space. This photo she took the photo she took to represent something significant. I've never experienced any problems here. However, I know that my wife has. I know that while she's been on break duty by here, groups of kids have hurled abuse at her, verbal abuse. And now she only teaches sixth form. She didn't know who these students were, so there's nothing she could ever do about it. And it left her feeling very vulnerable, very, very nervous, and very powerless in the situation. And so I've never experienced any issues here. I quite like walking past here. There's always a student with something nice to say, and it's lovely. But there's always that niggling worry. And there's so much to this account that we haven't got time to talk all about here, but there's a couple of bits I want to pick out. First of all is this highlight here. She didn't know who these students were, so there's nothing she could ever do about it. And Foucault describes surveillance in this way as often very diffuse and often very difficult to locate. And that's exactly how this teacher was feeling here. And another example I'll share later on as well. Not knowing if people are observing walking past. In the photo here, there's a tower they might be viewing from, and this constant idea that you're not sure who's viewing you at certain times. And consequently, the second bit I've highlighted is this idea that there's always a niggling worry, that always fear that something might be happened. This teacher, this person said they've never experienced anything here, but the fear that something might cause that anxiety as she either walked or was on duty in this space. Another photo is this one. This photo was taken by a head teacher who was describing their experiences or experience of giving assemblies in the assembly hall, and said the following. So that's where I give my assemblies. So that's one of the places where I feel a bit uncomfortable because there's so many of them at the same time that I'm talking to. And I give my assemblies quite often, and I don't hide my sexuality from anybody. So the student body knows that I'm gay. But when I'm doing my assemblies, I feel scared. And I don't know if it's because I know that they know that I'm gay, and therefore I'm like afraid of them. I don't know, hurling a slur or something. And I asked the teacher afterwards, I said, has that ever happened? And they laughed at me. Of course not. It seemed improbable. But their rational brain realized that. But that didn't change the fact that they felt this degree of discomfort standing at the front of the assembly hall, because again, it's this area of surveillance. And if we think about this with the Lefebvre triad, this space is conceived perfectly for its purpose. Row after row, tightly packed chair, all facing a focal point to be addressed by a teacher. And actually the panoptic gazes of the teacher over the students. The kind of perceived routines in this space, students enter silently, they leave silently. It's a place of respect, it's a place of learning. And yet their lived experience, their overlapping of these two conceived and perceived spaces was still one of anxiety for fear that something might happen. Because actually, even though they're the one with the panoptic gaze here, it's having opposite effects. They're worrying that they're going to be read as LGBT, and they're worried something might happen. Even though consciously recognizing that's almost improbable, it doesn't mean their experience of stress, which is the next point, is any less real. So with this idea of stress in mind, then I want to explore those themes just in a little bit more detail. And actually what I've described so far is often people who belong to the LGBT community experiencing a form of minority stress in these spaces. So I'll just briefly define minority stress before we go on. So Mayer says, one elaboration of social stress theory may be referred to as minority stress to distinguish the excess stress, which is a key word in this definition, to which individuals from stigmatized social categories are exposed as a result of their social, often a minority position. So Mayer says that minority stress theory says that all people experience stress, general stresses, the stress of being a human being in life, but particularly the stress if you're a teacher working in a school, very stressful environment. But Mayer says on top of those general stresses that everybody experiences, people that belong to minority groups, and this research is founded in LGBT, experience additional overlapping stresses that compound to create unique forms of stress. So the first form of that is what Mayer describes as distal stresses, and they could look like some of the following things. It could be having experienced prejudiced and discriminatory events in your life. And while it's sad to say, if you're an LGBT person, it's almost guaranteed that you've experienced some form of prejudice or discrimination in your life, or certainly seen it happen to other people in the community, and you have that kind of hyper-awareness as a consequence of that. It can come from microaggressions, all the sort of classics. I tend to get this one in the taxi people. If you've got a girlfriend, from well-meaning taxi drivers who are trying to make small talk, but obviously it's just kind of a dripping tap reminder, a death by 1,000 paper cuts reminder that you're not the normal, the thing that's expected of you. Most recently, we were at a wedding a few weeks ago, and there was quite a few gay couples there. And the photographer was clearly from a different century because he came over and immediately he couldn't compute what was happening. And he said to me and my partner, he said, so what's the relationship? Are you brothers? What's going on? It's like he couldn't understand. His tiny mind was blown. But, it sounds, on their own, those incidents might feel slightly lighthearted or kind of it's not a big deal. But when you have those all the time, it's the reminder that you don't belong to the mainstream of the thing that's expected of you. And that's what heteronormativity and cisnormativity looks and feels like on a daily basis. And often it comes from the things that are missing. I shared my photo at the start when I was at secondary school because I was missing all of these things. There was no curriculum. It was, Section 28. You couldn't discuss LGBT plus inclusion. There was no positive images, no role models, no sort of celebrations, no guidance and support. There was a void, which pulled in kind of, bullying and homophobia and discrimination, all the things that people learn from when there aren't positive things in place. And there's, many of you may have seen the brilliant Netflix series Heartstopper, kind of this queer coming of age teen drama. And many people, adults, sort of similar ages to me, sort of, nearly 40, described a melancholy about watching that program. And that's because that melancholy came from feeling, I can't believe what impact this would have had on me as a young person if I'd had this, if I'd had that blueprint of what it is to be a happy LGBT person rather than surrounded by all of these negative narratives. So to recap so far, the mayor says that general stresses are stresses that everybody experiences, the human condition, if you like. And then on top of that is the overlapping stresses, the distal stresses, often these sort of events that I've described here. But having these experiences of distal stress, these prejudice and discriminatory events have knock-on effects that can create almost internalized experiences of stress as well, which is the next form of that, described as proximal stresses. And this is a really crucial point to try and understand, or for me to try and understand what's happening in these photos, because the fear of these events potentially happening, the ones we've described, can be as stressful as them actually happening. And so while in the accounts I've given so far, nothing really happened in those spaces, but the fear of them potentially happening can produce the effects of stress as if they are actually happening, which is quite a tough thing to get a head around sometimes, but it's important for us to think about, particularly if we work in schools or if we're leaders. It can also be this constant discussion or kind of internal monologue about coming out. People think you come out once to be LGBT, but no, you come out all the time. But particularly in a school, because every year there are new students or new colleagues or new stakeholders, new parents. And it's this constant thinking of how would I come out, when, to who, how often, what if one person knows over here and they don't, and they tell each other, this constant kind of negotiation and thinking about that. And in schools, like I say, that can be really, really quite challenging due to the huge number of people to think about. It can come from this isolation of thinking no one is like you. I wrote in our book that we published this year that when I started teaching, I genuinely thought I was the only gay teacher in the world. Because, LGBT people don't necessarily recognize one another unless they're in a specific safe space, or it's kind of, you're very clear about it. And that can lead to real feelings of isolation and loneliness, and really speaks to the importance of having safe spaces or LGBT plus inclusive spaces. And I've alluded to this already, but it can create this constant assessment of risk where you're constantly 2 steps ahead of the conversation about what you can and can't share. And I'm going to share a little illustration on the next page, which kind of beautifully captures what that can feel like and the implications for kind of your social battery, really. So I'll give you a moment to look at that. And I just think that just really illustrates what this 2 steps ahead thinking can feel like, the sort of permutations in your head, all the things you can and can't say, and the batteries representing the energy level that you have. And if that's for multiple people a day, that can have very serious and long-term effects in terms of the ideas of stress that we've talked about. So let's explore this final photo then, with those pieces of theory in mind. So this was a photo taken by a participant, which is a path from the main building over to the sixth form block, and they were describing their experiences here of crossing this path. Excuse me. So that is where I have to walk across quite often because I'm going to my sixth form block science lessons. And so during lesson changeover, it's a space that's full of lots of students. And so I feel a bit uncomfortable there because I've sometimes felt like people have made, I don't know, either like a comment or something. They've not said anything directly, but I'd noticed. I feel like I've noticed something, like, like as if they're communicating with each other about something when I pass by. Excuse me. And so it's one of those places where I'm not as comfortable because I just don't feel as comfortable being visible there. And I think this sentence kind of really highlights some of the bits of theory we've looked at so far. I feel like I've noticed something, like, as if they're communicating with each other about something. So nothing had happened in this space explicitly discriminatory, but this idea of surveillance, this idea of feeling like you're being watched and it being diffuse and difficult to locate, means they're having these experiences of proximal stress. Even though nothing's happened there, they're fearful that something might happen there. And even though they were out and visible as a member of staff, they still felt unsafe in this space because they felt like something was happening. And I pushed on this slightly more to ask about the specific thing that happened after, and they couldn't describe anything. But it was this general feeling that created this feeling of anxiety or stress or a lack of safety in these spaces. So I'm going to return to those 4 photos in just a moment and this idea of unsafe spaces. But I would just like to pause before we get towards the conclusion, excuse me, and come to the theme of disruption. Because I said at the start, if something's assumed of you, if it's assumed you're heterosexual or cisgender and you're not, it can create a form of disruption, a form of almost like a transgressive act in that space. And that can have some positive benefits. So I'd like to share just one more photo that kind of illustrates an act of disruption, an act that kind of had really positive implications, I suppose, in terms of visibility. So this photo was a trans RE teacher, and they worked in a Catholic school. And obviously that, they were worried about working there and the challenges that might present. And this is just before, when they started at the start of the year, they allowed students to ask questions on a piece of paper and fold them up and read them out and answered the ones, they felt appropriate to answer. And one of the questions was this from a student: can you be a transgender RE teacher? The student had asked. And then the teacher said, yes, you can. And they explained the sort of amazing transgressive kind of progressive implications this had for the school and for students in terms of their understanding, their empathy. Most of them hadn't met a transgender person. Obviously, they learned particular things through Catholicism that might be at odds with that. And they shared a number of stories throughout the year about how this small act had kind of developed empathy in students and kind of given them a real understanding of what it was to be transgender. And this is another quote. So they said, so I actually said to my year 8s the other day, we were doing a lesson on ordination or something. And they were like, what if you're transgender? And I was like, you wouldn't be allowed to be a priest because the church says that you're technically still a woman. And they're like, no, that's not fair. And I'm like, I know, I totally agree. And they were describing this moment of like solidarity where the students at the start of the year were perhaps a little bit unsure about how to discuss the issue, where we're becoming allies and developing their advocacy. And they talked about how they had, these students went on to have other conversations with students in the school and really sort of progress the culture. And things changed beyond that in terms of policies and approaches to diversity and inclusion. So it's only one small photo, and there are a number of those. But I thought just the importance of balance in this presentation, that actually there can be some positives in terms of having a visible LGBT identity in the school and these moments of disruption or degrounding, as Butler calls them. And to hook this onto the kind of minority stress theory, Mayer talks about actually, if you've been through some of the things we talked about, often you develop this idea of minority resilience and have what we might describe as positive marginality, or another writings described as queer capital. The wonderful Catherine Lee, I'm not sure she's on this call, she may be, if she is, thank you for this brilliant work you do, Catherine. She's written a number of wonderful articles, but she wrote one a couple of years ago, which talked about why LGBT teachers may make exceptional school leaders. And she talked about some of the many benefits that come from having an LGBT identity and kind of navigating it in a school space. And I won't go into these in too many detail, but we'll share the link afterwards if you'd like to read it. But she said that LGBT people often have, they're really good at reading people, from the example I gave a moment ago, and have really good emotional intelligence. They often have this real strong sense of compassion and commitment to the inclusion of others. If you've experienced discrimination or isolation before, you know how awful that can be, and you don't want that for others. So you have this kind of real passionate sense of compassion. Often it means you can make really good connections with people. And if you share something personal, like being LGBT with someone else, often it lowers defenses and they then feel comfortable sharing something personal with you. And it can create these really strong senses of connection. It can mean you're really good at managing uncertainty, again, back to the previous example. And it often gives people a sense of courage and risk-taking from having to navigate some difficult conversations or kind of situations in their life. I would also argue it gives you this this critical consciousness, this kind of critical awareness, because once you start to see, I always use the matrix analogy, like the world being produced in code. Once you start to see the ways in which schools are produced as heteronormative or cisnormative, and the small things that do that, such as microaggressions, you become hyper aware of it, and you can identify and calling them out or having conversations around them. And often you realize how other people, racism, for example, it allows you to see the ways in which schools are produced, often as white spaces, for example. So it gives you this kind of critical consciousness and critical awareness, which I think is incredibly powerful when doing this type of work. So to conclude then, let's return to these 4 photos, these 4 unsafe spaces that we started with, and just to draw together the 3 big pieces of theory that I've used to kind of think about them, to really get to grips with this kind of thought. Why do the LGBT teachers feel unsafe in these spaces when nothing has ever happened to them there? So firstly then, school spaces are produced and often experienced as ones for the inclusion and affirmation of cisgender and heterosexual citizens, which is great if you are those things, but if you're not, it can create other concerns such as this of surveillance. So LGBT teachers then experience schools as sites of surveillance, which over time lead to this internalization of surveillance, as we've explored, which then has these knock-on effects of stress. Surveillance produces proximal stressor effects, and therefore schools are often experienced as unsafe spaces. So these 4 photos, which, if you know, without narrative, seem fairly innocuous, are the spaces in which people feel they're being observed under surveillance, and they have these internalized experiences of stress that make them places where they feel and described as places unsafe for them within the school. So just the concluding thoughts then in terms of what we've discussed so far. So cisgender and heterosexual colleagues have this kind of access to what we might describe as like frictionless movement around schools. They don't have to have this constant worry about the safe space where they can and can't go, and where they can and can't feel safe or share something. You know, a cisgender person discussing their spouse, their wife or husband isn't seen as discussing sexuality, whereas for an LGBT person, that's not the case at all. And I think it's important we kind of conceptualize that as a form of privilege that cisgender and heterosexual people often have in these spaces, and then how do they use that to be allies for others? But consequently then, for LGBT people, our visibility becomes this constant point of navigation and negotiation in spaces, particularly educational spaces. And then crucially, which is the hard bit when I'm speaking to leaders about this work, schools can feel unsafe even if they're not, which is a real tough thing to kind of think about, but it's important for us to conceptualize, and it's important for leaders to think about in terms of their approaches to equality, because actually it very much calls for a need for an equity model rather than an equality model to inclusion, because actually if people are feeling unsafe in spaces where, well, there's no direct threat, if they're still experiencing stress and uncertainty in those spaces, more needs to be done for them to feel and be reassured that schools are safe spaces for them. And just on a practical level, there are specific support that is required for LGBT teachers. I sort of joked at the start, there was no sort of course on the PGCE about how to deal with these things, but it's a serious question. You know, there's nothing in the core content framework about what professional identity is for all people, let alone people that belong to minority groups. So specific support's required for that in the core content framework, the early career framework, and ongoing through careers, particularly as LGBT people go to positions of leadership, because often they avoid those for fear of having the spotlight that we described earlier. But then just to kind of draw this back to the positivity to finish up the presentation, as I said, some teachers saw their visibility as a source of strength and a chance to disrupt the existing norms. And when I was completing or doing my research, you know, I was sitting across from these people sharing these incredibly important, incredibly powerful stories, and I felt a bit selfish, or it's unfair that only I got to hear these stories because they felt so important. And as a consequence of that, that led to the launch of a podcast called Pride and Progress, which I'll talk about in a second. But the podcast was a chance to share these narratives and for other LGBT teachers and educators to hear from other people who are in the profession. And at the end of each podcast, it's very important for us, we're sharing positive narratives. So the final question of the podcast is, what's the best thing about being an LGBT teacher? And in terms of some of these positives and disrupting of norms, I'd just like to share a 2-minute video which shares or has some of the answers to this question. So we have 3 full seasons of that podcast now. So if you'd like to listen to some of the more of the episodes, it's available through all good podcast providers. And this year we released a book as well called Pride and Progress, Making Schools LGBT plus Inclusive Spaces. And that's aimed at primary and secondary colleagues who want to sort of focus on this work. All the things we do, including teacher networks and support, are available on our website at the bottom there. And Pride Progress is our handle on most social media. I've got a paper called Under the Spotlight, which explores the themes of visibility from this discussion in a bit more detail. That's available through open access. And hopefully a paper is soon to be accepted, which looks at the idea of space, surveillance and stress in more detail that's been discussed in the presentation today. So huge thanks for listening. We'll have some time for questions in just a second. I'm on the artist formerly known as Twitter. I won't say the name I've changed it to there if you'd like to follow me. And the next slide has got the references that I referred to. So if you want to do a screen grab or photo, if there's any of those you would like to follow up. So I'll unshare my screen there. So thank you so much for listening. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.